These videos are generally about why the US didn't like Russia and Russia didn't like the US and why it went on for so long and why so many people paid the price for that. Some of it will go by quickly, and I'll try to be neutral except where I find it appropriate and/or convenient and/or fun and snarky not to be. Back in the late 19th century, things were starting to get pretty good in the US if you were in the right industry at the right time. The railroad was in full bloom in America, and after a mere few decades of existence, you could get anywhere from anywhere, and more importantly, if you ran a company, you could get anything anywhere. What Americans used was changing too. Oil, for example, which had been around for millions of years, was suddenly becoming an important commodity, and it helped that black gold was discovered in Spindletop, Texas, the first oil strike down yonder. There were no cars in those days, and instead of gasoline, petroleum was good for getting kerosene, which, when burned carefully, could power lamps, which was good for the coal mining industry because it meant that miners could actually see what they were doing. It was also good for fueling space heaters, which meant that people could stay warm in winter instead of dying all the time at age 30. Anyway, the 19th century was the time of the captains of industry we've all heard about. You had your Rockefellers, who refined oil, your Carnegies, who made steel, and your J.P.'s Morgan, who didn't produce anything, but could successfully maneuver all that money around with his bank and come up with, yes, more money. On the other hand, most industrialists, then and now, were more like this guy, who were just trying to survive in a world where one needed a job. So, if you were a business person, how could you get a company off the ground? Here's the technical part. One model involves being an entrepreneur, that is, a person with an idea and a dream. The entrepreneur needs money to start up the business, and it's usually necessary to find investors and stockholders who can share the risk with you by supplying capital, that is, money for the company to start operation. You then set up a business and hire workers. Then you produce your product or provide your service, you sell it, and voila! You have some money. Much of that money goes back into more supplies and into the factory for improvements and maintenance and to pay workers. A lot of it goes to the investors to pay them back, and then, if there's still money, the entrepreneur can finally get some of it and enjoy life a bit more, if that's his thing. Though the US is being used as a model here, a lot of industrial development was going on elsewhere too, particularly in Europe. A German philosopher named Karl Marx and his colleague Friedrich Engels, and yes, the facial hair is accurate, spent time in England and wrote of the conditions they saw there: very low wages, terribly long hours, lack of safety, child labor, and so forth. They also noticed that in most corporate schemes, the workers were not only being overlooked when it came to sharing in the profits the company made, but the more money the company was making, the less the workers were valued, because their wages were generally not going up accordingly. This was the exploitation that would become a buzzword later on. And moreover, said Marx and Engels, while the workers could actually show the results of what they had produced, the capitalist could only say that he had something to do with the theoretical construct known as money. Nevertheless, it was the capitalists, not the workers, who controlled the means of production. Marx and Engels wrote up their many observations and ideas in the well-known works Das Kapital, or Capital, that is, money for investment, and the Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels described a society freed from the shackles of feudalism, the medieval system of loyalty to lords and kings, and giving way to, gasp, capitalism, in which individuals could create profit and ever more efficient industry. An advanced form of capitalism would be followed by a class conflict, after which a system of socialism would benefit from all of this. The concept of private ownership of business would be replaced by control of the economy by a central party, where the party, in turn, would represent the people. As an added bonus, class distinction would start to disappear. For the hardcore, there was the final step, communism, a utopian state resulting from the developments of the previous stages. Here, industry provided you with all the material goods you needed, and your philosophical training allowed you to achieve peace with the world. And the state, now unnecessary, would wither away. Social inequality was indeed an issue. In Europe, it was usually about class, ruling class versus working class, etc., where in the US, it was about wealthy versus poor, the haves versus the have-nots. Though there was opportunity to become a have, being an at-the-bottom have-not was still pretty sucky, for reasons mentioned before. And if you were a have-not and an African-American, well, you were even lower on the chain of being. And if you were a woman of the Lakota Nation, well, you get the idea. For most American capitalists, the fact that they provided people with any kind of job, even if it was cleaning out the cobra pit, was already their contribution to society, and one can kind of see their point. If it was suggested to them, however, that they might also owe their workers a living wage, decent conditions, and even a sick day or two, this would have handed them a rather substantial laugh. Nevertheless, some progress was being made in the U.S. on workers' rights. In some industries, unions were organized, and after well-planned strikes and boycotts, some employers began to make some concessions, like a less than 12-hour workday and occasionally more money. There was, for example, the Pullman train strike of 1894, held when the Pullman Company, which built railroad sleeping cars, rather important when people spent much more time on trains, cited business losses and cut employee wages by 28%. Though broken up in the end by U.S. Marshals and the U.S. Army, the strike ultimately involved about 250,000 workers and made its leader, Eugene V. Debs, a nationally known figure, and later a socialist candidate for president. Labor unions such as the AFL and the IWW and the Teamsters now became a presence to be dealt with, but their power was far from an equal match to that of business and industry, which, though not omnipotent, could hire scab labor and, well, lots of goons. Outside labor and progressive circles, there was fear and suspicion of these organizations that wanted to alter the very fabric of society. Most regular people, and even the government, didn't quite understand the varying goals of people who said they represented labor unions, social democracy, socialism, communism, or anarchism. The word red was a popular catch-all term for all of these, and was one that was incidentally just fine for hardcore lefties. These were the red agitators everyone was afraid of, agitator from the Latin verb agitare, meaning to shake. And there was indeed something to be concerned about from radicals, especially when one considers that an anarchist agitator had killed President William McKinley in 1901. Back in Europe, for capitalists ever in search of new markets and new spheres of political influence, the idea of colonies in far-off places that were rich in raw materials was very appealing, especially since you could now get to and from these places a little faster with all those coal-powered steel ships. In time, almost the entire continent of Africa had been swallowed up by European countries, with even Belgium occupying the Congo, a place much, much bigger than Belgium itself. Sorry, but Belgium? The U.S. had precious little, though not absolutely nothing, out in the wide world. Russia, though it had expanded into places like Azerbaijan, where it was taking great advantage of oil reserves there, was still technically in the feudal stage, with an absolute ruler in the person of Tsar Nicholas II. By 1898, the U.S. was pretty antsy for some overseas influence, especially in the Caribbean, most especially in Cuba, a Spanish colony, which was so near and yet distant. Fortunately for the U.S., Cubans had been trying to revolt against the Spanish crown for some time, and because the Spanish had to spend so much time and money to show that they were still definitely a political and military presence in the area, their position was weakening in Cuba. When the USS Maine blew up in Havana, newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst and young Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt pushed for a war and got it. Within 4 months, Spain was defeated and was forced to give the U.S. Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The U.S. didn't get Cuba, but it did get a forever lease on Guantanamo Bay, which was a pretty good consolation prize. Plus, not everything in American expansion was dependent on Spain. The U.S. had already gained control of Hawaii after a revolution largely sponsored by American businessmen on the islands. Then they uncovered a tiki idol, which brought them terrible luck, and their brother wiped out on his surfboard just after— no wait, that was the Brady Bunch. Anyway, over in Russia in 1898, workers and intellectuals formed the Russian Socialist Democratic Labor Party, and party congresses were held in Minsk, Brussels, London, and Stockholm, though usually they had to be held in secret, leftists still not being very popular in the mainstream, especially in Russia. In 1903, the party split into 2 factions after a disagreement over party membership. These factions were known as the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, majority and minority, the former led by a radical named Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. The final break took place in 1912, and the Bolsheviks were eventually to become the Communist Party of Russia. In 1904 and 1905, strikes were held, and operations within the empire were disrupted on numerous fronts, including through mutinies on ships in the imperial fleet. At the Winter Palace itself, hundreds of peaceably assembled workers were shot down by guards. Over the next year, skirmishes throughout Russia resulted in thousands being killed by imperial forces. In the end, the Tsar remained in control, but was forced to give in to some demands, such as the establishment of a parliament and allowing political parties to form under his very eyes. Nevertheless, Lenin was forced into exile for 12 years for his revolutionary activities. Back in the US, things were not so bad at the top. President Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive and not a bad friend to the workers. He even did radical things like establishing certain areas as national parks, which would be free from development and just remain as they were forever. Roosevelt was also dedicated to being a bona fide trust buster, a breaker-up of monopolies, because they contributed to an unhealthy business community and poor labor conditions. In a monopoly, or trust, as the term was applied in the 19th century, all or almost all businesses in the same service or industry are bought up by another business. The result is that one company controls the entire industry, the mono in monopoly, and there's almost no possibility for new businesses to emerge in that service or industry. Plus, prices can no longer be determined by competition because there is none. If you want a colander, you pay whatever the monopoly, the one business, wants for it, or you just don't get one. The trust-busting campaign was actually the enforcement of an act that was already on the books but was sluggish in operation, the Sherman Antitrust Act, signed in 1890 by Benjamin Harrison, a president whose only other known contribution to history was purposely concealing whether he had admitted North or South Dakota first as a state so that neither could claim to be the first. One of the companies that was attacked was Standard Oil of New Jersey, run by John D. Rockefeller. In the early 20th century, Standard controlled over 90% of oil production and 85% of sales of petroleum products. In 1911, Standard was determined to be an unreasonable monopoly and was broken up into smaller companies. Not that Rockefeller himself was suffering, but it was a bad omen for huge industry in general. At the same time, however, TR was enjoying America's new role in the world. The Spanish-American War, which he had pushed and in which he had personally fought, made the United States a certified Big Bad Mama, and in 1905 he sent the U.S. Navy, the Great White Fleet, around the world just to show people what American ships looked like. When refused permission to build a canal across a very narrow area of Colombia, he helped foment revolution there, eventually leading to the independence of Panama, which was officially recognized by Roosevelt almost as quickly as he could shove a canal treaty under President Guerrera's nose. Which brings us to 1914, World War I. What can you say? The silver medal winner for worst things humans have ever done to each other. Commonly glossed over far too quickly, which is quite unfair, I will gloss over it far too quickly. Among the combatants were the Russian Empire and the German Empire, who were enemies despite their respective rulers being cousins. Oh, and the English king was another cousin. Seriously. The Reds had become very strong in Russia, and 1905 was not at all forgotten. In the winter of 1917, the war was going very badly for Russia. Even worse when Nicholas personally took over command of the army. Troops were demoralized and hundreds of thousands deserted. When strikes arose in Petersburg, workers protested first the war and then the ineffective government. Soldiers, wounded and dispirited, refused to fire on the protesters, especially since the protests coincided with International Women's Day and much of the crowd consisted of women. The Tsar was finally deposed in a revolution by a loose affiliation of rather mildish left-wingers in February of 1917. He and his family were executed a few months later. The new interim leader had been named by the Tsar, Prince Georgy Lvov, who didn't last long, and was replaced by the non-royal Alexander Kerensky, who didn't look like this, but he had a much less fascinating beard than Lvov, so I decided to keep his picture there. Well, as Kerensky found out, transforming a country while you're at war and trying to maintain a careful alliance with frustrated radicals and trying to feed a starving nation is very difficult, and Kerensky and the provisional government needed time to get organized. They never got it. Impatient Bolsheviks decided to take action in October of 1917, mere months after the first revolution. Lenin, who had returned, had numerous followers, especially in military circles, which, if you want to seize power, is a good place to have friends. Moreover, the provisional government had declared there to be no enemies to the left, which only strengthened the communist movement. The Bolsheviks seized power in October, and Lenin found himself the new head of Russia, with his close associate Lev or Leon Trotsky in command of the new Red Army, which was an official name rather than a pejorative term. Things were finally going to change in Russia, and the peasants were finally going to learn what was good for them.